Welcome to everyone. Welcome to everybody in the audience. Welcome to people online as well. And tonight's event, as Rebecca says, is a chance for us to celebrate all the authors shortlisted for the 2025 prize. We have 6 books and 6 authors, but we only, in speech marks, have 4 authors with us in person. Apologies from William Dalrymple, who is in China. It's a good excuse, but it happens with all these prizes, of course. When it's a global prize like this, you're bound to have time difference issues. And somebody traveling normally. And Sunil as well. Sunil Amrith is with us. You can see hopefully his lovely, cheerful face. He's live. He's alive and with us and online in the USA. Now, all 6 authors are nevertheless with us in every other way in the topics we discuss and in our congratulations on reaching this incredibly impressive shortlist. Now, over the next hour, I'm going to introduce you to each author and each book individually. And then together, we're going to talk as a group. And if you're going to join us remotely, if you're joining us and you want to ask questions at the end, make sure you put your questions into the chat at the end. And there will be a chance for everybody to ask questions at the very end. So, on with the show. Our very first author is Bronwen Everill. If Bronwen would kindly come up to the stage. Now, this is something that we're really proud of this year. Everybody has a theme tune and a theme colour. So, Bronwen, I think as the very first author, you need to explain what your theme tune is. And the colour is to match the cover of the book, I think. Yeah.
That's right. The theme tune. It's a collaboration between different composers, singers, songwriters, based here, so Mumford & Sons, famously a British band, and 2 from South Africa. So the song is called Wona, and the idea was that it was an equal collaboration, which is very much something that the book is advocating for. So I would recommend checking out Wona.
Well, a short introduction to your book, Africonomics, great title, and an equally great subtitle, a real provocation, A History of Western Ignorance. Bronwen's an historian, originally from the US. You've lived in the UK, I think, and you were director of the Centre of African Studies at the University of Cambridge. And amongst many of her great achievements and titles in her working life, Bronwen now teaches at Princeton and is a research affiliate at the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past in the Department of Economics at Stellenbosch University I know very well. Her previous books are Not Made by Slaves and Abolition and Empire in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Very sensitive and bold topics, as is this one. Now, welcome. You're going to give us a short reading, and then we're going to talk about your book.
Sure. So I've chosen something from the conclusion, which hopefully encapsulates the argument of the book. So as the stories in this book show, the people who worked to intervene in enslavement, poverty, and underdevelopment in Africa ran into repeated obstacles because of their misunderstanding of how slavery was connected to development and how to balance wealth creation and economic growth with development for all. They misunderstood where their own economic power came from. They misunderstood the forms of and choices about economic power that they encountered in Africa, and they did it over and over again. This book does not set out to answer the question, why is Africa poor? Instead, it asks how ideas about labor, money, and value change over time. How are we measuring wealth and poverty? What are the goalposts for success? Is development a process or a goal? What assumptions about how the economy works or should work are we making in answering those questions? These are the questions that I've asked my own students to think about over the past 15 years of teaching. They're the questions that have been at the heart of scholarship on African economic history and colonialism. And I hope that by bringing them to a wider public, we can open up new conversations about global and national inequality, about racial prejudice, and about the way that we imagine the economy. Africonomics suggests that we need to stop approaching African economies as if they are automatically in need of Western intervention. It argues that misunderstanding the causes of observed economic behaviors can have profoundly negative outcomes, and so truly understanding those observations in their cultural and especially their historical context is vital if we want to stop repeating the same mistakes. Economic imperialism isn't only exploitation. It can also, as this book argues, be the superiority of good intentions. If development has had a historic problem with trusting people in Africa to make decisions for themselves, then maybe it's time to give real democracy its chance. Maybe it's time to trust in people to have power over their own choices.
Thank you very much. Now, the basic idea behind this book is that we need to think differently about African economics. And you've outlined that could easily be the beginning of the book, as it is at the beginning of the book. What would you say, what sets you off on this path? Because there's so much in this book, and you do cover everything brilliantly. But just to give us the gist of it, what were the main, if you like, you talk about everything, what was misguided, and what were the promises, and what should have been done differently?
Yeah. So I really started researching on this book inadvertently during my PhD. I went to Sierra Leone and Liberia to do a PhD on those countries as they were set up in the 19th century as anti-slavery colonies. I was very interested in that period. I arrived in 2008, shortly after the global economy crashed in a spectacular fashion. And I left London and arrived in Sierra Leone with a lot of people who were there to advise the Sierra Leone government on how to fix its own economy. And I found that very interesting. And I wasn't there to talk about that at all or to think about that at all. It was just happening in the background while I was doing research about the 19th century. But the longer I worked on the 19th century in Africa, particularly in Sierra Leone and Liberia, but as my research expanded, I looked at other countries as well. The more I saw these parallels and the sort of repeated history of these kinds of interventions and this way of thinking that really reflected that people arriving with these good intentions of how to intervene in these economies didn't necessarily think about what they were leaving behind or the sort of cultural context of their own economic development.
And what you do so differently and so brilliantly is really to see it from the African point of view. How difficult was that to get at that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say not necessarily as difficult as a lot of people think it might be, actually. There has been a real renaissance.
Why do we think it's so difficult?
I know. I think there's been a real renaissance in African economic history over the past 15 years, and there's really excellent research being done on very specific topics in African economic history. I think there is a pipeline problem of getting that kind of research out to a wider audience.
That's being done in Africa.
Yeah.
In Africa, all the different countries of Africa. Yes.
So I mean, you mentioned that I'm a research affiliate at the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past, based at Stellenbosch University. They are a real incubator for this kind of research, but there are other places around the continent that are.
And how do they regard you conducting all this research?
They're very friendly about it. I think, there is a lot of history there, and I think for the people who are living and working in Africa, this is part of their history. I think the problem is that a lot of the interventions are coming from places where that history is just not part of the education, it's not part of the discourse. We hear about the slave trade, we hear about imperialism, we don't necessarily see all the other things that are going on. And so the book really is focused on, how moral economy is working in these places, how their ideas about, the function of the economy, about, what is good for their local economies are happening from the ground up.
You're turning a lot of previous ideas on their head, which is absolutely as it should be. And you say ignorance, you use this word ignorance right at the beginning. So, I mean, what has the reaction been from the West? Because these are pretty major discoveries you're making.
Yeah, I think it's come at an interesting time because I think that there has been a big a big shift towards understanding some of the trickier consequences of aid on the continent. And I think, unfortunately, some of that has been captured. That approach has been wrapped up in other kinds of national politics. And so it comes at a really interesting moment from that perspective.
You talk about how the West has failed, and you give a lot of detail of that. How has Africa failed?
I think that has been cataloged in great detail by a lot of authors, and I think there are, plenty of examples of things going wrong over the years. I think what the book is trying to illustrate is that a lot of the things that we document as failures are actually the sort of responses, the natural responses to the kinds of incentives that the West has offered in the previous generation. So, if you look at the Cold War, for instance, there was a lot of emphasis on supporting leaders who would do the bidding of one side or the other in the Cold War. Cold War ends, and suddenly the table turns, and it's democracy. That's what we're after. And so, because so much of the power continues to lie with the West, economic power, political power, there is constantly a sort of backfooting of, I think, a lot of the leadership. And so every generation is sort of failing in some way or another because they have not kept up with whatever the current demands are.
If we look at the metrics of we use in the West, like GDP, IMF, and so on, and what would you counter with what you've discovered in Africa, sort of, because why should they be imposed on Africa?
Yeah, GDP is a really great example because GDP was created as a metric at a time when industrialized economies in the West were largely seeing lots of formal employment. And they didn't really fit what was going on in the African context, where lots of people were self-employed, lots of people were subsistence farmers. It didn't really work. Samir Amin goes into great detail in his work, thinking about how the GDP figure is not working. Now we're in a position where that's also true in the West, where lots of people are gig workers, lots of people are working in the informal economy, lots of people are working 2 jobs. And so that's one of those cases where we can actually learn from the ways that African leaders have had to adapt.
And you do make some incredible discoveries in this too, and it really has made me think different. Mobile banking started in Africa.
Yes.
There's so much we could touch on. And Bronwen, for the moment, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to end it there.
Thanks very much.
Now, the second author we have is Lucy Ash with The Baton and the Cross. Very happy to see you, Lucy, and many of you in the audience will know why. Lucy and I spent many years working together at the BBC. So Lucy is a journalist, and she worked for 3 decades at the BBC as presenter of radio and TV documentaries, starting off in Moscow in 1990, demonstrating her great skills as a linguist, a reporter, and an expert on Russia and post-Soviet countries. Lucy left the BBC a few years ago, as did I, but this hasn't stopped her pursuit of stories and investigations into the region's social, political, and cultural issues, also writing her very first book, The Baton and the Cross, Russia's Church from Pagans to Putin. Congratulations. Very proud. Now, Lucy, that music, I know what it is, but you probably need to explain to everyone. It's a brief
I might get onto it a little bit more after my reading, because it'll make sense, but it's Pussy Riot singing their notorious punk prayer in the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour in 2012, February, for which they were jailed for 2 years, despite the fact that Masha Aliokhina and Nadia Telekonikova both had small children. The church was extremely vindictive, and there was no question of turning the other cheek.
I think that sets up the reading very well, actually. So okay. You're going to give us a short reading.
I'm going to give you a short reading from the beginning of my chapter on culture wars. which is the penultimate chapter in my book before I get on to the war in Ukraine. Andrei Tkachov, a married archpriest and father of 4, is not a man to mince his words. He once told a group of Orthodox young men how to avoid being henpecked by their future wives. You need to break the woman over your knee, knock off her horns, bend her over, rub her face, stuff her into a washing machine. Do not allow her to wear makeup. It's the pornographic paint of modern civilization. Any man who cannot break a woman's will is not a real man. He should avoid marriage and become a monk instead. Women are arrogant, nasty creatures, he added, his voice rising to a crescendo. If a woman doesn't get whacked in the face at least once in her life, she won't understand anything. One of the young men present secretly recorded this spiritual conversation and shared it on Orthodox websites. Tkachov was unabashed. He compared his directness to a coach addressing a football team, but denied that he was promoting domestic abuse. Surprisingly, though, a female member of the upper house of the Russian parliament appeared to do just that. Yelena Mizulina told a group of reporters that wives were usually to blame for the rudeness, absence of tenderness and respect in families. We women are weak creatures and don't take offense even when we're hit, she said. A man beating his wife is less offensive than when a man is humiliated. Mizulina and Tkachov made these remarks in 2016, but they seemed inspired by a famous text written 5 centuries earlier. Domostroi, domestic order, is a set of guidelines for a harmonious household compiled by Silvestre, a priest who took Ivan the Terrible's confession. Filled with quotations from the Bible, it portrays a world in which women lead subservient and secluded lives. Alongside advice about how to knead dough or pickle cabbage, the book advocates hitting children to save their souls. I think I'll leave it there.
Sharp intake of breath. I mean, and there's a lot of that in there. But I mean, the brilliant thing is you actually go through the whole of history and prove that what is happening now has been happening for a very long time. You put it all into the context. So basically the story behind this book is that the Russian Orthodox Church has shown survival skills over a millennium and exercised both enormous religious and political influence. And now again, of course, it's the right hand of power sanctifying Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Now, what you've always done, Lucy, in your journalism is combine research and your investigative skills as a reporter, and you've done that again with this book. You decided to do it that way, the individual stories as well as the historical context. How difficult or easy did you find it to do that? Because it's your first book.
Well, yeah, it was a bit more complicated than I thought at the beginning, because it was going to be originally like an Orthodox road trip where I was going to go around all sorts of weird, wonderful parts of the Russian Federation, meeting all kinds of different monks and priests. And then the war happened, and that obviously wasn't going to be possible. So I had to draw on the research that I had done before. I last was in Russia in October of 2021, so about 4 months before the full-scale invasion. But I mean, like many people, I wanted to know how it could be possible that the spiritual leader of the country, the biggest faith, the Russian Orthodox Church, could be calling this unprovoked invasion of a neighboring country a holy war. But I sort of realized that to answer that question properly, I'd have to go back into the history and go back to when the Slavs first became Christians back in 988. And I saw a pattern emerging that the church always had this poisonous kind of coexistence, a sort of toxic embrace with the power, whoever the power was, whether it was the Mongol Khans, whether it was the Muscovy princes, whether it was the imperial czars, the Politburo, and now, you know, Putin. And but to go back to the music that I came in on, I sort of first of all started thinking seriously about doing something in depth on the Russian church when the Pussy Riot women were jailed, because it was an extraordinarily divisive moment. this 40-second performance that earned them 2 years in prison divided Russian society. Some of my friends were saying they didn't understand it as a political protest at all. They just said, well, why did they have to go into a church and offend believers? They didn't realize that the whole point was they were criticizing the fact that Patriarch Kirill a few weeks earlier had described Putin's leadership as a miracle from God. And he was incredibly sort of oleaginous and talking about what an incredible leader he'd been of the country. So I got interested in them, and then I was making a film about domestic violence. And what really shocked me is the way the church behaved when an MP was trying to push through some kind of legislation against violent partners, restraining orders. And the church lobbied so hard to stop this from happening. They said it was going to be the genocide of the Russian family if violent men were not allowed back into their homes. And now I see that in a way it was a sort of first step in the war, because as the MP who now lives abroad in the US told me, the church's opposition wasn't just ideological. It was also sort of part of the whole systemic approach to conditioning Russian society to accept egregious acts of violence and to almost reframe violence as a state virtue. Sort of that is how you show your manliness, that's how you show that you are a good citizen. And we're seeing this played out in the most tragic way now with this war.
How would you describe Putin's reliance on the traditions and symbols of church? I mean, does he profess to be a religious man?
He certainly does profess to be a religious man. And maybe in his head he is a religious man. His actions are not that of a Christian in any way that we would understand it when you're talking about, trying to make the world a fairer, better place and respecting and loving your neighbour.
Yes, the understatement of the evening.
So, but I mean, it's something he came to fairly late in life. He didn't sort of show that much interest when he was in Dresden, for example, or when he was working for the mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. It was a little bit later on when he went to the church that's right next to the Lubyanka, the home of the Russian security services. He was taken there by an oligarch who's also living abroad now. He sort of learned the ropes, learned how to cross himself and how to hold a candle in church. He says that he was baptized secretly by his mother and a neighbor. Well, and there's no reason to say that that's wrong, because that was the case with many people in the Soviet times.
We have to leave it pretty soon, but I do want to end on Ukraine because it is so important. And, there are two Orthodox churches in Ukraine, as we know, it's the Russian Orthodox and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Which is winning? I mean, how much pressure is the Russian Orthodox Church able to put on Ukraine? Just very briefly.
Well, in the areas that Russia occupies, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, formerly known as Moscow Patriarchate, the one that's been in communion with Moscow for 300 years, doesn't exist anymore. It's now just the Russian Orthodox Church, talking about most of Donbass and Crimea. It's a much more complicated picture in the rest of Ukraine. And this is something that people in the Kremlin, Lavrov and Putin and others, have been trying to weaponize, this idea that the Ukrainian government is persecuting Christians, because there have been instances when priests from the church that was linked to Moscow were found to be making anti-Ukrainian statements in their sermons and occasionally even passing information about Ukrainian army positions to the enemy. I feel that sometimes the Ukrainian security services have been a bit heavy-handed in their approach. But the message that's going to Capitol Hill, which really is quite concerning, is if you listen to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's going around saying that Zelensky's government is killing Christians. But there's no mention at all about all the churches that have been blown up and destroyed, the 67 clerics that have been murdered by Russian forces in Ukraine. So, it's a painful picture, because some people want to stay with the church that they were brought up in.
We must end it there. But Lucy, congratulations so much. Thank you very, very much. Sunil. Sunil Amrith is there smiling away. I hope you can all see him.
We got to stop from mixing up the lane.
Sunil, you won't be able to bounce up onto the stage, unfortunately, but you can bounce across the screen. Now, you're in the US, and I know that you're going to give us a reading as well, too, from The Burning Earth, an environmental history of the last 500 years, and then we'll talk about it after that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rosie. I'm so sorry I can't be with you all, but I'm delighted to be able to participate this way. I'm going to read a little bit from the end of the prologue and the beginning of the introduction of the book. The most compelling writing on nature often comes from a place of deep feeling for the texture of a particular landscape and a sense of connection with the other species that share it. This book rests on different foundations. It builds from a patchwork of attachments to many different places, distant from one another. Most of them are cities far from any vision of pristine wilderness, cities where rich ecosystems hide in plain sight. It is history for an urban and globalized and divided planet, written from a starting point of empathy for the all-too-human dreams of fossil-fueled escape that now lie in ruins. Once upon a time, all history was environmental history. Life was governed by the seasons. Scarcity lurked even in years of good fortune. When the weather gods were fickle, misery followed. Human societies used their ingenuity to wield fire, dam rivers, clear forests, all to mitigate the risks of living. They harnessed the power of the animals they shared shelter with. Every culture had its gods of beneficence. Every culture had dreams of plenty. 1,000 years ago, those dreams grew more insistent. The scale of human impact upon Earth expanded with the growth in human numbers, and so did the range of possible futures. But the twin foes of pandemic and famine never receded for long. And then things changed. The most privileged and powerful slice of humanity began to believe that the human battle against nature could be won. They believed that natural limits no longer hindered their quest for wealth and power. They believed that their ready access to the millennia-old energy embedded in fossil fuels made them invincible. The most powerful people in the world believed, and some still believe, that human beings and other forms of life on Earth are but resources to be exploited, to be moved around at will.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you very much. Give me a round of applause. And a short introduction to you, Sunil. And Sunil is Professor of History and Professor in the School of the Environment at Yale University, and he grew up in Singapore and lives in Connecticut. He's the recipient of multiple awards, including a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. I've always wanted to meet a genius. Sadly, you're online. But he's also won the 2024 Fukuoka Prize for Outstanding Achievements in the field of Asian Studies. His latest book is about the crisis, as you've been hearing, crisis of planet Earth, the climate crisis, the burning Earth. And basically, this book is, as far as I understand it, it's the historical perspectives of the climate crisis and the impact of humans on the environment and vice versa. I'm amazed that this book hasn't been written before, and I think it is an amazing book. Can you tell us why you chose? You're actually an urban city dweller. You grew up in Singapore. You didn't grow up in the countryside. You didn't grow up living in trees or, sort of tree houses and writing, sort of poetry. You are very much the opposite of the kind of person I would think who would write about the environment. So tell us about it. How did you come to write this book?
I suppose that's about the paradox and the sort of angle that I bring to this. I didn't grow up, not only did I grow up in an incredibly urbanized environment, I grew up with no real feeling of connection with the natural world. And if you'd asked me as a teenager what I thought were the most burning issues, I was not unaware of environmental concerns in the 1990s, but I would probably have ranked them fairly low on my list of things I cared about. I cared about human rights. I cared about social justice. And For a long time, I would have seen environmental concerns as perhaps secondary to all of those things. And I think my own journey of realizing that those questions are absolutely linked is what brought me to write this book.
Do you blame humanity, or are you putting humanity in the context of the environment? Or are you saying that the environment and nature should always be equal, regarded equally to humanity?
I think blame is probably the wrong word. And in fact, that's a perspective I think I tried to steer away from. I hope it's a book that's written with empathy for the kinds of constraints and decisions and dilemmas that human communities around the world have faced that might well have led them to take actions that have turned out to be environmentally self-destructive. And I think that really more than anything else, I'm interested in this book in unintended consequences. If I ask the question, what has brought us to this point of the climate crisis? I think there's one part of the answer is greed, the greed of perhaps a minority. But some of it is good intentions, really important liberatory projects in the 20th century, for example, to extend people's lifespans, to bring more choices to people around the world. And now we can see that some of those changes have led us to a point of great risk. But I wouldn't see blame as necessarily my main intention here. And I think it is really the last of the things you said that I think we always need to see human beings in relation to the rest of nature. And the question maybe is, how did we ever forget that? If you ask anyone in the room, do you think our well-being as human beings, as human communities, depends on the clean air and water and the health of the forests? And most people would say yes, but we've actually built our political and economic systems as if that were not true.
You give the example of certain countries where you think they've actually got the balance right. And I'm thinking of Ecuador in this particular instance, which you say is, obviously they've got it enshrined in law that nature, their environment, their country is equal, has equal rights to the humans who inhabit it. Can you give us a few other examples? I think Bangladesh was another one, which is really, really positive examples these are too.
Ecuador is very interesting because I used Ecuador as an example because it's the first country that I know of where written into the constitution, after 200 years of global constitution writing, the Ecuadorian constitution accords rights to nature personified as Pachamama or Mother Nature, if we want to use that term. And that was really new. I think it's more complicated if we ask the question what effects that has had. I think it's more an aspiration and an intention to hold human interests and ecological well-being in balance with one another. In practice, that has not always worked out, even in Ecuador. I use Bangladesh as an example for a different reason. We tend to hear horror stories about Bangladesh in relation to the climate crisis. And there's no question that Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. But I think that's only part of the story, and this actually reminds me of Bronwen's book and the kinds of arguments that Bronwen is making, because in some ways, Bangladesh is presented as a place that needs outsiders to go and rescue Bangladesh from the climate crisis. And I think the point that I make is, in fact, if you look at the reduction in loss of life from cyclones, which are only growing more intensive, what Bangladesh has achieved in the last 20 or 30 years is absolutely remarkable. The cyclones on a scale that would have taken 500,000 lives 30 years ago now have a death toll in the tens or the hundreds. And this is because of very unglamorous things. It's because of cyclone shelters. It's because of local grassroots activism. It's about making cyclone shelters hospitable to women, but also to domestic animals so that families are not reluctant to evacuate when they need to.
I'm really grateful that we actually are mentioning some positive stories too, because all these books, of course, are, they outline the stories and the difficulties, but they also give some, wonderful positive outcomes and solutions, if you like. And the other thing I wanted to actually congratulate you on also is this incredibly brilliant description you give of the mobilization of people during war times. And it's a really major form of migration too. And I had never seen it in that context before. This has such a major environmental impact. So maybe that's something you just quickly tell us a little bit about in your research into that.
That was the part of the argument that I hadn't anticipated. I thought I'd put both of the world wars into one larger chapter with many other things. I ended up writing one chapter about each of them, about 80 pages of the book. And I thought of the First and Second World War as events that we know quite well, that have been extensively written about, many, many brilliant books. But there was an interesting environmental perspective on the two world wars, and I really did come to see them as moments of profound escalation in both the technological capacity to cause environmental change and indeed environmental destruction, but also a lot of the new ideas and the uprooting and the upheavals of human communities that came from those, I think, had lasting consequences, which very much shaped the second half of the 20th century when the climate crisis becomes visible and manifest.
You also speak about a tipping point. How urgent is this tipping point? I mean, are we in it? Is it about to happen? You know, when does this all become, if you like, when does it go beyond history?
There are many I think there are many tipping points. Just last week, the Global Tipping Points report, authored by Dr. Tim Lenton and colleagues at Exeter, but scientists from about 20 countries, suggests that we've already passed the tipping point when it comes to coral reefs and their health. They're seen as being in irreversible decline, and that there are other tipping points which we're closer to than is comfortable. So I do think this is very urgent. I also worry sometimes that if we overemphasize the language of tipping points, that can also feel paralyzing for all of us who continue to believe that other futures are possible and that our actions do matter. So I think we need to balance a sense of real and present danger with a sense that positive changes at maybe more local scales are unfolding all around us as we speak.
After writing the history of the environment and humanity's interaction with them, where do you go from here, Sunil? What's the next stage? I mean, you're looking at the defining issue of our time, and you've written a history of the environment. I can't imagine there's another book after that.
If there's another book after that, I think it will be at the other end of the scale. Something very small, something very micro, something
maybe
perhaps
a light
more
fiction novel, something. We're very, very grateful to you. Thank you, Sunil, very much indeed for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
And now I'd like to welcome Sophie Harman onto the stage. And Sophie's going to talk. She is going to talk about Sick of It.
Through my bad fortune, off the top of a tall building, I'd rather done it with...
Sophie actually looks like her picture. There you go. Very nice. So you do. Very nice to meet you, Sophie, and congratulations on this book. So Sick of It, another incredibly provocative title. I love these titles. The Global Fight for Women's Health. Now, Sophie is Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University of London, teaches and researches on global health, African agency in international relations, feminist political economy, and she's published 8 books and has worked for over 15 years on global health politics. It's a long list of things you've done, and this book, on the surface, it could seem like a detail, but you've written a whole book about it. I know you're going to read a little bit. Just tell us the gist of the story.
Okay. Do you want me to do the reading?
Yes. Why not? Because that does set out the reading you've chosen sets out the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Women's health is huge currency in global politics. If you want to get elected, forge diplomatic relations, change the politics and society of another country, gain international recognition in the world, or make money for your charity, one of the best political tools with which to do so is women's health. In turn, if you want to run a health system, a major health campaign or project, or sustain a $1 million aid budget, you need women's cheap, or sometimes free, labour and expertise. The world works off the back of exploiting women's health, but rarely for the purposes of improving women's health. This is why nothing changes for the better. It is a total misconception to suggest that women's health gets little attention in the world or political leaders don't really care about it. Far from it. Some aspects of women's health, notably reducing the number of women dying from childbirth and pregnancy-related complications, are the #1 thing that governments around the world continuously agree to act on. This has led to countless global strategies, billions of AIDS dollars, high-profile proclamations at the UN, all centred on women's health. Women's health has visibility, it has money, it has prominent women leaders calling for change, global political commitments, a women majority workforce, and the knowledge to stop preventable death and strategies and targets to make this prevention a reality. Women's health just gets lots of attention. It's just the wrong kind. This attention never has the purpose of making women healthier and happier. Gosh, no. Women's health either gets too much attention for the wrong reasons, trying to curtail women's access to contraception, winning votes by keeping the tradition of FGM, female genital mutilation, or restricting abortion. Or not enough attention for the right reasons, research, funding, correcting male bias in science. Women die when they don't have to, not because of a lack of attention, science, or evidence on what works for women, but because the exploitation of women's health as a means of attaining and sustaining power in the world.
Very, very much. So basically, you're saying that we know the causes of diseases and death among women all over the world, and we have the funding, and philanthropists are giving money, but women are still dying when they don't have to. How did you go about researching this, and why did you decide to concentrate on this area?
Oh, okay. I think in a way this book has been sort of in me for the last 20 years. I mean, some of it goes back to doing my PhD in 2005 when I first met community health workers who underpin this billion-dollar aid industry, and it's just women doing this work. You know, donors would say out of the love for the job. But really, I think the real kind of moment where I decided that this is the book I wanted to write was in February 2020 when I walked into the Ministry of Health in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Another shout out to Sierra Leone. I think if you want to understand the world, you should start in Sierra Leone. It's a great place.
That's what I have learned tonight.
You should.
Actually.
Everyone should. Everyone should. And so I walked into this Ministry of Health and someone asked me to wash my hands. And I had this horrible sinking feeling because I'd been in the country for a few weeks then talking about what had happened to women during the 2015-16 Ebola outbreak. And they told me stories about how during quarantines, rates of domestic violence went up, how when the schools shut, women were burdened with care in that way, how women were having to educate their communities about hand washing and things like that, and how more women died of pregnancy-related complications than they did of Ebola. And I can remember just thinking, oh gosh, this is going to happen again. And it's going to happen. At that time in February 2020, we didn't know, what would happen with COVID-19, but we knew it was going to have an impact in the world. And I just had this horrible sinking feeling. And the more I thought about it, and admittedly, when I went home that day and went for a swim, I was kind of swimming along going, what is up with the world, right? Trump's back in power, cutting funding to abortion and safe contraception. Lots of people in the aid industry are saying that they're having this post-Me Too movement, but that just seems to be making more women busy by getting more women to do the job. And it just felt like things were getting seriously worse. But at the same time, everyone was saying, oh, it's fine, we're now woken up to the fact that women are invisible and we're going to solve it. And I was like, well, no, actually, that's one part of the problem, but the problem is really politics. And as soon as I started to pick at this, the more I could see that actually this is it. This is it's not that women's health is ignored. It's actually that it's a huge tool of political currency in the world.
You call it a kind of branding, political branding. It's as though women are being used, and that's the trauma victims and so on are being used for political ends. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the stories that you came up with?
Yeah, so the book is in sort of two parts. So it looks at how women's health as an issue is exploited to gain power, and also how women in the system themselves are exploited. But on the point of the issue, you can see this in lots of ways. You could see it possibly that this audience is more familiar with in the way that women have to sell their stories about their health to get funding. And, this, I think the tale in the book is of Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, who I'm a big fan of. I have colleagues that I know who are working in places like Gaza. So hugely respect MSF. But they were taking stories of young survivors who come into their clinics without their consent and using these images to be able to fundraise.
And the photographs we all know about.
Yes, the photographs we all know about and the saga about. But it's so common across the sector. And you could see it if you go to conferences that, young women, predominantly young black women from Africa, have to come on stage and sell their stories in ways that men never have to do. So those are some of the ways we can see that exploiting. But it's also It can also happen in a more, well, I don't know if this is a positive light, but I also talk about health washing in the book. So some of you may be familiar with Rwanda. Most people, I think, heard of Rwanda because of the 1994 genocide, but what you might not be so familiar is the huge transformation they had in women's health after the genocide. Rwanda saw huge reductions in maternal mortality, had the highest level of people living with HIV on antiretroviral in the continent of Africa, it had rolled out the HPV vaccine, all these amazing things in women's health, all led by this incredible woman. It was kind of like a utopia of women's health, but actually has been using this as a tool of international diplomacy to wash the reputation of Rwanda's authoritarian state.
Now, the health systems and development aid around the world are under threat, as we know. And in the US contributions to development aid, I mean, they're pretty devastating data at the moment. What is the solution then? Is it to ask big donors again, philanthropists to come out, or where are you seeing the solutions to all of this? Solve the problems of the world.
Well, I just really want to say, so I think a lot of people are looking at the cuts at the moment, and rightfully so. A lot of the activists working in the UN that I know, they are fighting really hard to keep their programs going. But also, and I really want to stress this, I think everyone's looking about what Trump is destroying, not at what he is building. And so what you see now is this new generation of women's health being used to build a new multilateral world order based on women's health. And this is, well, I can go into further detail, but just to say, this is happening at the moment under Project 2025. The solutions that we have, though, I think is to be very aware of these political dynamics. So, for example, this role that Trump has at the moment, everyone's like, well, it's just aid money, it's health, there's nothing political there. Absolute nonsense. But also my biggest thing, the biggest solution I have that everyone can take away is never, ever advocate for women's health for anything other than women's health. So don't say you need to invest in women's health because then women are going to boost your GDP, or this is going to make your country more secure from viruses and pandemics. Absolutely not. That undermines women's health, and it's part of the problem that I explore in the book.
Do women know that?
Do women know that? Or women?
Well, the women you talk about, I mean, in the book, you talk about this being something that that women should be treated obviously better than they are being treated. But do women themselves know that they can stick up for their rights and that they can counter these arguments? And
100%. 100%. I mean, so part of the book ends, and the colour green is to represent the green wave movement of the reproductive justice movement around the world, where you saw change in legislation around safe abortion in countries like Argentina and Ireland that people thought that would never happen. That happened because of social decriminalisation, for women coming out and telling their stories, for normalising what was happening, and activists coming out, and even when they were banned, they would tie green scarves to their rucksacks and things like that. So, oh no, women know.
Good. Just checking. Thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you. And congratulations, too. I was going to say we have a musical interlude now, but we do have music, and I'd be very happy if Graham Lawson would come onto the stage, because he's going to give us some soundtracks. Sorry we couldn't have longer of all our pieces, but that is actually Graham playing, I believe. You need to explain what you're actually playing, Graham.
That's an accurate replica of a bone pipe from about 27,000 years ago, being played in an acoustic environment. It should really be in a prehistoric cave. It's actually the stairwell outside my lab in Cambridge. But you get the general picture.
It's absolutely remarkable, as is this book, Soundtracks Uncovering Our Musical Past. Now, Graham is an archaeologist, musician, historian, and musical detective, which is something I love the sound of, and with a lifelong fascination in excavating music's fossil record. He's held senior research fellowships at Cambridge and the Freie Universität Berlin, and he's pioneered the application of science to music's prehistory and tracing musical continuities and connections across the world. It's really a remarkable achievement. I'm surprised the book is that thin, because you have covered everything. You've gone back to prehistory. How did you get it all into that book, and what is the book about, before you give us your reading?
Well, it wasn't originally that thin. But my editors have
Made it that way.
Yes, or demanded that it should be that way.
So basically, this is the history of man's relationship with music.
It's a story of the human race from its origins to the present day, or rather from the present day to its origins, which is how we archaeologists tend to see it. Taking music as the kind of theme to carry us through the story. And
What does a musical archaeologist do?
we drink a lot of tea. But in addition to that, we have to do quite a lot of different things. One has to do quite a lot of archaeological science, because the bottom line is the evidence and the science. There isn't really a received and established history and prehistory of music. We have to make up that history ourselves out of the evidence. And to do that, we have to first of all search the museums of the world looking for unconsidered fragments, things that have been missed by previous scholars, because a lot of this stuff is extremely fragmentary. And having done that, we have to then move to the workshop and the laboratory, where we analyze the objects and squeeze every last grain of evidence out of them.
Do you actually go to digs as well, archaeological digs?
Go to digs,
shipwrecks?
primarily to conservation labs. It's very difficult to chase these things around as they're actually happening. What you need to do is to have a network of spies. And so I get called in usually on day 3 when something has been found that people are scratching their heads about. And then they think of me and they think, well, maybe he's got a few ideas about this. And so I come in and I help them through the process. And that takes us, first of all, into the laboratory, particularly the microscope laboratory. So much evidence is preserved on the surfaces of objects. It's absolutely fascinating.
Before I ask you what you've discovered, and a few more of the discoveries, you give us a short reading, that'd be lovely.
I will.
Thank you.
This is from the prologue. It's one of several possible readings, but I thought you might like this one. It's a fine, calm summer's evening during a warm spell in the last ice age, and someone is sitting in the mouth of a limestone cave in southern Germany, fingering elaborate tunes on a long, slender pipe of swan bone. The haunting sounds drift out across the valley to lose themselves among the trees and the bird song and the endless clamour of the river far below. Fast forward around 37,000 years, and in central China, a gorgeously attired crowd circles a huge open tomb, looking on as the body of their dead king is solemnly lowered into his grave. The year is 433 BC, and amid the splendor of the equipment that's going to be buried with him, we see drums and stringed instruments and flutes of various kinds, while a vast lacquered timber scaffold supports a carillon of more than 60 magnificent heavy bronze bells. We skip another 2,000 years and see a beautiful violin sink to the bottom of the Baltic Sea, where it joins the other wreckage of a naval battle that erupted on the late morning of the 1st of June 1676. And today, still shrouded in the deep, cold darkness beneath the ice of the Weddell Sea in western Antarctica, rest the instruments and gramophone records abandoned by Sir Ernest Shackleton's Imperial Transantarctic expedition when their ship Endurance, crushed by the pack ice, foundered on a November evening in 1915. Shackleton's musical memorabilia are still to be recovered. But all these other instruments have been excavated and form parts of an extraordinary musical jigsaw puzzle that archaeologists are now piecing together around the world.
Remarkable. Thank you very much. You mentioned the violin and Antarctica and all these other examples, and I wonder what is the best environment for an instrument or fragments of the instrument to survive? I mean, I know there's always a good peat bog.
There's always a good peat bog.
But I
what
just
would we do without peat bogs?
Absolutely.
Latrines are quite good as well. Wells are good. The Baltic Sea is extremely good. The Baltic Sea, when anything sinks to the bottom of the Baltic Sea, it finds itself in a happy position, which is that the water is too salty for freshwater microbes to flourish in, but also too fresh for saltwater microbes to flourish in. And so wooden objects survive to the extent of complete wooden ships lying on the bottom of the sea in a way that, for instance, in the English Channel would be absolutely impossible.
How far back does your history go, your prehistory? When did we start to make music?
We just don't know. That's what the book set out to probe. But the material evidence goes back to around about, currently, I must emphasize currently, around about 40,000.
This is a story in progress, isn't it, really?
Archaeology is a huge story in progress. And the earliest musical instruments that we have found, which are undeniably musical instruments and capable of playing complex music, date from around about 40,000 years ago, which is in Europe, and these are in Europe as it happens, because that's where we've been looking mainly. That is very close to the arrival of our species in Europe.
We've always, I imagine, made sound, and sound and music go together.
We must imagine so, and indeed the boundaries between music and other forms of sound making are very fuzzy and are closely related. The relationship, for instance, between musical expression and perception and speech and language perception are presumably very, very closely tied together. And some people, like Steven Pinker, for instance, who famously described music as auditory cheesecake riding on the back, to mix my metaphors, of linguistical development, it could well be that the development of language and speech arose because of aptitudes that we'd previously developed in a more musical context in terms of expressing our emotions in sound.
Finally, I'd like to talk to you about musical notation, because one thing that we can't do is play the music that was actually played, even when you've recovered or recreated the instruments, as I know you've done with a few and played a few yourself. The notation hasn't survived. I wonder when notation began and when we can sort of refer back to something that we could actually play today.
That's a very good question. I would correct you a little bit on that idea that we cannot make music without notation. I don't think that's what you meant, but it's often said
without reading the exact music
reading the
from that
exact
time.
sequences of notes. But these prehistoric pipes that we have preserve a lot of information about the way that people were articulating the notes that instruments could play. And so from them and from microscopic study of the wear around the finger holes on, for instance, the pipe that you just heard from 27,000 years ago, we can get a pretty shrewd idea of the kind of musical range that instruments had and the music thereby, and provide really quite a tight framework within which we can then improvise, extemporize melodic and rhythmic musical expression. But to go back to your question about notation.
Briefly, we have to.
Briefly.
Very quick.
The earliest evidence that we have currently of musical notation, which is undeniably musical notation, takes us back to around about 2000 BC, around about 4,000 years ago, which is not very far as we archaeologists look. But it goes back.
If you say so.
But we have notations on pipes, including the one that you just heard. We don't know what they're notating, but we don't yet know, but they are certainly notating something. And it is conceivable that it's music that is being notated.
It's a remarkable achievement. Graham Lawson, thank you so much for bringing us this book soundtrack. Thank you. And finally, before we have a quick discussion with everybody together, I want to, if you like, put William Dalrymple in the spotlight, even though he's unable to be with us. You've all heard of the Silk Road. Well, forget the Silk Road. We're going to talk about the Golden Road and the ancient India, how ancient India transformed the world. Now, William Dalrymple, as you know, is recognised as one of Britain's greatest living historians. He's a great communicator and writer on history too. He's the best-selling author of White Mughals, The Last Mughal, Return of the King, and these are all winners of major prizes. He's the co-host also of a wonderful podcast called Empire with Anita Anand. Now, he's presented lots of radio and TV. He writes regularly for newspapers and magazines, as you know. He's had visiting fellowships and many awards. He was also presented in 2018 with the prestigious President's Medal by the British Academy for his outstanding literary achievement and for co-founding the Jaipur Literature Festival. Now, William is a born storyteller. He's written books for a long time that appeal to everyone and also to academics. So here's a short film now of William Dalrymple reading from his shortlisted book, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World.
Hello, my name is William Dalrymple, and I've been shortlisted for my book, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. I'm filming this in the British Academy, but I'm afraid you will, when you get to see this, I will be far from here in Hong Kong, and it'll be 3 in the morning for me. So I've opted to do a pre-recording, so forgive me for not joining you this evening. I'm going to read a passage from The Golden Road, which describes the murals at Ajanta, which are probably my favourite artworks in the world. And so this is a bit of a sort of fanboy passage about how beautiful they are. Nowhere does the world of the Buddha come more dramatically to life than in Ajanta, the earliest surviving expression of Buddhism in paint. The murals take us to an ancient world so astonishingly lifelike that even today, even in reproduction, the images of the Buddha's life can still make you gasp as you find yourself eyeball to eyeball with a watching monk who may have attended one of the early councils who gave shape to the Buddhist faith, or with an Indian warrior who may have fought one of the battles over his relics. So faithfully lifelike and realistic are the faces of the people depicted, so direct are their expressions that you feel that these have to be portraits of real individuals, glowing still with the flame of eternal life. There is none of the idealization or otherworldliness you see in later images of the bodhisattvas. Instead, there is something deeply hypnotic about the soundless stare of these silent, often uncertain early Buddhist faces. Their fleeting expressions are frozen, startled, as if suddenly surprised by the king of Varanasi's decision to loose his arrow, or the nobility of a great elephant breaking through the trees. The most disconcerting thing about the people in these murals is that they appear so very familiar. 2,000 years after they were painted, these faces convey with penetrating immediacy the character of the different sitters. The alert guard, the king caught up in the excitement of the hunt, the obedient son fetching water. Indeed, so contemporary are the features, so immediately recognizable the emotions that play on the lips, that you have to keep reminding yourself that these sitters are not of our world, that they depict a court and jungle world of hunters and hunted, and Buddhist monks and devotees that vanished from these hills more than 2 millennia ago.
Congratulations also to the endowment on being shortlisted. The 4 shortlistees who we actually have physically. Join me, that'd be great. Sophie, Harman, and Graham Lawson. Congratulations again. Can't join us for this discussion. 3 women, 3 men. I think that's the first in this particular prize, but that's also rather wonderful. Now, all your books are historical. They're grand, brilliant, sweeping histories. They're also about changing perspectives and changing our minds about the topic you've chosen. How did you do that? Why did you want to do that, and how did you do it? And how difficult was it, I suppose, too? Bronwen, I haven't spoken to you for at least half an hour. Let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was increasingly facing a disjuncture between the kinds of things that people were talking about at conferences in African economic history, at meetings and discussions, my students, and the kinds of perceptions that a lot of my students arrived with, and that I saw more generally in the public discourse about Africa, and the gap was growing over time rather than shrinking, and so for me, the sort of real pressure for the book was actually, I felt that it needed to get out there to a wider public, and I think that it was, maybe luckily timed in terms of this being a moment when there has been a lot of discussion about, whether there is a sort of growing multipolar moment, and there is a chance for some of these African states to recapture some of the agency that has been.
It's interesting with any book to find the right moment to write
pure
the book.
luck. That's pure luck.
Sometimes it's pure luck. Yeah. I know with Lucy, you referred to the fact that you were writing this, of course, during the reinvasion of Ukraine, and of course not being able to go to Russia, and COVID, I should imagine, also played a part. But so how did you even begin to tackle this?
Well, yeah, COVID did play a bit of a part on my last trip, and I couldn't really tell whether people were saying they couldn't meet me because there was an increasing atmosphere of fear and people not wanting to be talking to foreigners, especially Westerners, and to what extent it was actually COVID. But I decided that this was a really important window into what was happening in Russia.
And you felt the urgency of the zeitgeist.
I did, because I've loved Russia all my life. Ever since I first went there as a 15-year-old, and I was getting increasingly uneasy by what was happening to Russian society, the way the space for public debate was shrinking, the way that people were sort of being totally brainwashed, especially older people, by all the propaganda on TV, and sort of crowd psychology of sort of deciding that something or someone is an enemy, and everyone's sort of ganging up on that. And a lot of things in Soviet times, we were talking at lunchtime today, in the British Academy, I was talking to Sergei Medvedev, who's just written a report about why has Britain become #1 enemy for Russia. And he speaks brilliant English because he went to one of these special English schools, and I went to one of those when I was 15, and they did Eliza Doolittle in perfect English, even with Cockney accents. I mean, I felt that there was a lot of Anglophilia and a lot of love towards Britain, and it was kind of mutual. And I saw a very sort of narrow-minded conservatism grabbing society. So that's the urgency to write this book.
Graham, I should imagine that when you've got 40,000 years of history, there's not the same urgency. But nevertheless, this is a lifetime pursuit for you. And I just wondered what, you felt that the pressure was to get as much done. And, how much more there is to discover in what you're doing.
There is, of course, a great...
You hold the microphones quite close to your mouth, I think.
There is, of course, a great... Too much?
No, it's
Just
good.
about
I'm
right.
just checking that everybody can hear. Thanks. Brilliant.
The coronavirus played its part, of course, in the writing process.
I should imagine it played a part in everybody's books. It's that
Yes.
kind of, that
But
time.
I was horrified the other day, rummaging in my laptop, to find a reference to this book, a first foreshadowing of this book, in 2002. Which
Either you
shows how
found
long
so
I've been
much
at
that you
it.
had to get in, or you just...
Well,
or you've
yes,
been-
it really, one of the things that I was particularly keen to get across was to the general reader was what a huge subject this is. And it just seemed year after year we go on describing music archaeology as something new, and it isn't something new now. It's really quite mature, and that fact needs to be established. And I thought the best way to establish this was to do it in the archaeological way and to go backwards in time from the present day back into deep prehistory and to what is in fact the central mystery. The central mystery is where music comes from, how we came by it, and what it means. And the way to approach that is not to begin with it, but to end with it. And I suppose if there was an urgency, yes, it was that I felt that it was high time that somebody wrote this book.
We called you a musical detective, or an archaeological musical detective. I suppose that's something we can call you as well, or all of you actually, detectives in what you're doing. Did you, Sophie, ever feel, and you all write in a very, in a style which is very popular, but also, and very accessible, but also very academic in the fact that everybody should be able to read this and admire it. Did you ever feel the pull between the two? Was there an issue for you in writing too popular or too academic?
Well, Sick of It actually started as an academic book that's sitting in a lonely folder. And I thought the urgency question was so urgent. I thought, no, this has got to be a bigger book. It's bigger than a boring book. It was a really boring book. So I was like, no, this needs to be a bigger book.
I'm so glad you wrote it the way you did.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so for me, I wanted to write a book that anyone can understand, because I find it very frustrating that lots of people say to me, oh, international relations, that's quite complicated, isn't it? The war in Ukraine, that's quite complicated. And I thought, well, my job is to make things, easy to understand and to explain them. And so how to do that and cover such a wealth of material in a way that people can understand, relate to, it's compelling. So I wanted to write a book where you could read one chapter from Zone 2 or Zone 3 on the tube into central London or any other major city around
Maybe
the world.
that's the way to write all books, really.
Yeah, and I wanted it to be compelling
Yeah.
and you wanting to change. So I think there was only one chapter that I was like, oh, this is boring. How do I get over this? And I'm not going to tell you the chapter because they're all great. But it was really rewarding. And it was really rewarding to try and think about that, how to tell these stories in a compelling way. And I really enjoyed it. And I think sometimes academics are a bit scared of that. And I think sometimes academics, we hide behind very big words and references. So to explain things is tricky. But we do it all the time with students, so why not?
I mean, Bronwen, the global scope and ambition of your book is massive, and getting it into a kind of, as I said, Graham, maybe it was twice the size also when you first wrote it. But how did you approach the research and what you were going to include and exclude, if you like?
Yes, I think this is probably something shared by all of us as well. Many drafts. I think one of the things I wanted to...
Did you want it to be a handbook of African economics, or how did you look at it?
Yeah, I wanted it to be a different narrative of the past 250 years than one that I think has been told quite a number of times through the history of the slave trade, its abolition, empire, its decolonization. I wanted to tell the story that I realized I had been telling my students for 15 years, unprompted by them. Usually because they would come to me with a particular kind of question or, a question about how to get into development, and then I would unload this effectively on them. So I think there were some things that I definitely wanted to include, some of the cyclical elements of the development question over time, some economic ideas that have reappeared over time with regard to how people talk about Africa. The myth of lazy Africa reappears over and over again. I wanted to address that head on in the book. But mostly I wanted to tell that story from start to finish with this perspective of the approach that people meaning to intervene in the economy were coming in and sort of following over that time.
It's interesting, now all the books are out there and you're all on the shortlist. It's easy to see that each and every one is a groundbreaking book, and obviously you would have set off thinking, oh, I'd like to write a groundbreaking book, but it doesn't necessarily happen that way. And I wonder, Lucy, particularly whether, as journalists we always want to sort of uncover something, investigate something, come up with some major research. Did you feel that you were writing almost as a whistleblower? Did you feel there was something you actually had to get out there, something that people hadn't said before about the church and this correlation with power and politics?
Yeah, I think some of the darker stories in my book you could also find if you rooted around in the Vatican, for example.
Can you hold the mic a little bit
Sorry.
closer?
I should know. I should be a mic
actually,
professional
yes,
by
you
now.
should.
I mean, I think some of the terrible stories about the way that clerics were bullied by the security services and the sort of persecution of people who are gay in the church. You could find those in many religions, and especially, in the Catholic Church. But I think it was exciting for me in a way to do history because I never saw myself as a historian. So I came across all these incredible characters like Sergei Uvarov, who came up with this tripartite slogan, orthodoxy, autocracy, nationhood. And it was like a sort of riposte to the French égalité, fraternité, liberté, fraternité, égalité. Like we're not going down that path in Russia. We have our own way. And I didn't know about this man before. I hadn't heard about him. And equally, a character at the other end of the 19th century, Konstantin Pobyedonosyev, who basically said only apes and total fools would ever think it was a good idea to give the people a say in how a country should be run. And he was a sort of arch conservative who very much influenced the last Tsar of Russia. So I felt it was an extraordinary adventure for me to kind of go and look at history books and find out about all these old people because,
Do you like being an historian then?
Well, I mean, I'm not a historian, but I just kind of have had these little historical snapshots. But it was an exciting ride, if you know what I mean.
Now, I want to ask you a question, which I know that we're all very concerned about this, but the British Academy is, as we know, the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and many of the disciplines in the Academy championed, but also covered in your books, are under threat from AI and funding cuts, misinformation, propaganda. There's a very long list. And how concerned are you, and how can you encourage more people to engage with these problems? Now, this is a nice, big British Academy question. There's no test here, really. I'm just really curious to find out what you think. I'm going to... Sophie.
I think the public does have an appetite for well-researched books and well-researched findings and new ideas. And I think we're right to be concerned about AI and these, post-truth and what is truth. But particularly in Britain, I think there is a thriving culture. I mean, think about In Our Time, I know that was honoured at the British Academy, right? How is that a popular radio? I mean, that's because Britain loves this sort of stuff, right? I think it's a serious concern. I mean, Sick of It was supported by the Leverhulme Trust and the Philip Leverhulme Prize In my day job, I'm also a research director, and I see the impact that the British Academy has and the Leverhulme Trust has on funding humanities and social science research, and it is fantastic, particularly for early and mid-career researchers. It's transformative. And I think academics are getting better at translating their research, and I think we have a responsibility to translate our research to say what we do, say that we're not just leeches on the tax-paying system, that we actually have a huge contribution to make. So I think academia is changing in that respect, but I also think, particularly here in the UK, you have a large appetite for really good research.
And we do like to learn, don't we?
Yeah.
Constantly curious. Graham, I mean, you straddle academia and sort of ground research and so on too. How would you regard, or how do you regard AI and all the other threats and, if you like, the need to engage?
I'm not so worried about AI at the moment, although I suspect deep down I am. But at a more superficial level, I'm more concerned about music education and the threats to music education. I gave a talk back in February, I think it was a dismal February evening in Cardiff, on an aspect of prehistoric music. And the irony was that just that week, or perhaps a week earlier, they'd announced they were going to close the music department of the university. And as a part graduate of the music department, which was Newcastle in my younger days, I thought this was absolutely tragic. And it's going on, it's not just in the universities, it's going on in schools. The cutback in individual musical instrument teaching, for instance, is something I think we should all be very, very worried about. It's not about learning a musical instrument, it's learning a life skill. And really there's an awful lot to be lost if we lose that.
Yeah. Bronwen, what about you? How do you, and did you not think I wouldn't ask you?
Yeah, I think it's interesting straddling history and economics, because I see the ways that economics researchers have really embraced AI in ways that I don't see in my history life, and especially not in my teaching, writing life. There's a lot of data processing in economics, which I think incentivizes people to use AI in ways that doesn't necessarily translate to other humanities disciplines, and which has sort of given me a sense of some of the where a lot of the AI optimism is coming from, that side of things, whereas as a historian, on the other hand, I see mostly AI pessimism, and certainly in teaching students, we're constantly trying to figure out what the balance is in terms of warning them off using it as a cheating tool versus trying to prepare them for a work world where employers are encouraging people to use AI as a productivity tool, and to sort of speed up the kinds of summaries and research and things that people are doing. So I do think it's an interesting moment to be thinking, to be working in this confluence of social sciences and humanities, and to be thinking about these kinds of questions, because there isn't a clear answer, I think.
Lucy, I mean, you couldn't have written this if you hadn't done the ground research. I mean, I know there were obstacles and so on, but this is not something that AI could have done. And and our area, journalism and the arts and books and languages, we're both linguists. They are all being cut back now. How worried are you?
Yeah, no, I'm very worried about the cuts in teaching languages in the UK. I think it's tragic. I mean, I went to girls' comprehensive school. I did Russian when I was 14, but you could also do Spanish, you could do Italian, you could do Greek. I think there were also some Hebrew classes for some students. And yeah, I think it's very sad. I agree with you that the cuts in music education are tragic, especially in primary schools. I think it's awful that kids are not doing musical instruments. I think some aspects of sort of new technology are interesting. Well, just like one example, there's Peter the Great destroyed all the portraits of Ivan Mazepa because he was, he sided with the King of Sweden. He was sick of his men being used as cannon fodder in the war. So he was basically, Peter the Great ordered all the religious texts in Ukrainian to be destroyed, but he also destroyed all the portraits. And there's been this new work, archaeological work, unearthing some skulls and trying to work out what he might have looked like, because all the Cossack hetmen, they all looked the same, and children at school were getting confused about who's who. And I spoke to one artist from Ukraine who has sort of made this new portrait of Ivan Mazepa, and I was very excited that she allowed me to reproduce it in the book. So, he had a very aquiline nose.
For the moment, thanks very much. And let's bring up the lights, and if you've got any questions in the audience, now is your time to pose them, and we might even have a few online. But I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if all of you sat together and wrote a book together? That would be fun, because I can tell there are lots of overlaps. Has anybody got any questions from the audience? Thank you. We've got a microphone here to ask of any of our 4 contestants here.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for their readings tonight and for their books. I've got a question for Bronwen. I wonder how you regard the last 20 years of Chinese investment in Africa, and whether you see that as an intervention in anything like the Western sense. If so, are they making the same mistakes? Are they making their own mistakes, or are they perhaps getting some more things right?
The investment from the Chinese in the African economy?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, and it's a question that I get a lot. You might not be surprised about that. I think one of the ways that it tends to come up is that people sort of recognize what I'm talking about, and then say, but aren't you worried about China? Like, don't we need to do something to prevent Chinese investment? And I think that actually plays into a sort of long-standing perception that the West needs to protect Africa from external forces, right? So whether those external forces are our own external forces, right? So our own exploiters that we are protecting Africa from, or whether it's other countries. And I think it all sort of stems from this idea that, as I said in my reading, Africans can't be trusted to govern themselves or to think about their own economies in a way that's beneficial to their people. So I have an example in the book of a particular moment in around 2008 when the Chinese were sending weapons to Zimbabwe. And there was a lot of concern about that particular relationship because China says that it invests, sort of amorally. They'll send, if somebody wants to buy, they will send. And I think a lot of the impetus coming from the West is, that we have to provide the moral conscience. And we didn't in that case, right? So dock workers in South Africa, in fact, refused to unload the weapons. And so I think that there are plenty of examples of, people having their own moral conscience about the economy, having their own moral economies on the ground that don't necessarily need our intervention along the way.
Thank you very much for that, Bronwen. Read the book, you'll find out. Buy the book. Any more questions? And one over here at the back, thank you.
Thank you for the talks. I'm a music lover, so I have a question for Graham. How do you go about studying archaeologically the evolution of singing? Because it's something that, I guess you can study maybe the evolution of lyrics or something like that, but how would you go about doing that?
Should we just repeat the question? How could you...
How
do you go about the archaeological research into singing?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Well, that is a difficult one to do. Where to begin? I think one can work around singing. I mean, there's a great deal of iconographical evidence, of pictorial evidence, and also there are quite a lot of texts about ancient music that help us to define what people were doing and how they were doing it. But these texts don't go very far back. I mean, we're talking about maybe 3,000 years at the most, and the images become more and more enigmatic, indeed baffling, the further back you go, beyond that. I think what we try to do in music archaeology is to try to understand how people's musical minds were working from the archaeological evidence of things like trumpets, flutes, and in other words, how they were using their breath to express themselves using instruments, and then use that as a way of a basis for imagining what they were doing with song. But clearly, song would have been something that we humans have had and used since time immemorial, really. And so I think someday perhaps we will come up with some evidence. One of the things that springs to mind is the things that I talk about in the book, the caves of Maros Pankep in Sulawesi. These are limestone karst caves. And in the caves, and we now have radiocarbon dates for the caves, for the cave paintings of around about 45,000 years ago. And at that time, we know that people were using their breath to spray pigment onto the walls of the caves when they were doing their painting. So it was very much a kind of performance that included their voices, or at least their diaphragms and their windpipes and everything. And I suppose we're working around the question. I don't suppose we'll ever get to the actual melodies that people were singing, but I think we can see that they were doing things even at that early age with their breath that wasn't just breathing.
I know you play several of the instruments you've discovered. Have we one more question and one more here? Very, very quickly. Gentleman here first and then over there. Thank you.
This is for Lucy. The Rwandan example you gave, do you believe that the politician actually planned it that way from day one?
So can you repeat the question, please? Do you think that the
Rwandan politician, the Rwandan woman politician who you gave as an example, who you said was trying to influence their standing in the world through the women.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. That's Sophie. Thank you.
I don't think that was the original intention. I think a lot of the intention of building women's health after the genocide was actually quite a lot of what Bronwen was talking about. It was like, right, we're going to do this ourselves because the international community let us down, let the genocide happen, sat in the UN Security Council, did nothing, aid doesn't help, we have to lead the way here. And Rwanda's brilliant at that. They're like, this is what we're doing. We're going to use the guilt of the genocide to get some investment, but then it's our way and this is what we want to do. Over time, you could see that certain politicians, particularly involved in the health sector, saw that this was an effective way of keeping aid money coming in and deflecting from the other part of Rwanda's reputation. And you can see this happening, and I detail this in the book, where you have the health minister calling out the Lancet for publishing a book review on a book that said that Kagame is authoritarian and that his opponents have a habit of getting into car accidents. They're coming out and they're saying this, right? And so there is a strategy of deflection happening there, but also part of that strategy is they got all the global health community behind them. So I could never really understand this. I would go to international relations conferences where they're talking about autocratization, Kagame's role in African politics, his authoritarianism. And then you go to a global health conference, they're like, oh, were you in Rwanda last week for the Women Deliver conference? Oh, isn't Rwanda amazing? And there was this complete dissonance that was happening. And you could tell it was very strategic. I also remember being in Tanzania and talking to a Tanzanian health minister who's like, oh, Rwanda. The World Bank keeps sending us to Rwanda to learn what Rwanda is doing. And Rwanda is a small country and And then they just give this kind of silent nod of like, well, you know, right? You know why they're doing it, right? And so I think that's what I wanted to try and talk about in the book, is that actually Rwanda is this amazing success story that over time becomes this tool of diplomacy.
Thank you very much. And final question here.
Question for Sophie. I just wanted to ask about contraception, because obviously, you know, for women, there's so many side effects. And I guess I know I have to be quick. I guess I just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of the future and like research going into that and like what that looks like on a global scale.
So I think just getting the basics of safe contraception, modern contraception that women can choose to have in an informed way in the majority of the world is just not even there. And that's not there particularly in lower middle income countries because of where the aid donors put resources in. So they're like, well, we could talk about modern contraception or just have sex with your husband and that's it. You know, that also rules out a variety of sex that happens in the world. Pointing to your wider question of innovation in contraception, I think that's happening all the time. There's lack of investment in it, as we know. But I think even just getting the basic modern contraception to most women in the world would be my aim. And that we are a long way off from that. And I think coming back to the tech question, in health, there's a lot of tech will save us all, you know. Bill Gates, Melinda French Gates, they're really big into this. And, you know, I love technological innovation. I love my contraceptive pill, not going to lie. But it can't happen unless you get the basics right in most countries as well. I think lots of people talk about tech, but you don't know how you're going to get that into a system where people have understaffed, underpaid health workers in the first place.
Of women being getting the information they need to pretty much, you know, what you were talking about. Thank you so much for that. We're going to end the questions here, but I just want to ask one question of each of you. Obviously I can't ask William and Sunil, but basically, if you were to sum up the main message of the book, if you like, the slogan you'd put on a banner if you were, you know, down at the barricades, the thing that you'd like people to remember most about your book and your message, your mission, however you want to see it. And I'll start with Graham at that end. Short and to the point, Graham. The elevator pitch.
I'll have to suppress my academic tendencies in that case. I'd like people to find that reading the book had been a fun experience, but along the way they had learned something about something that perhaps they hadn't thought about before, and how things that you haven't thought about before can actually prove to be really quite important in terms of our human story.
Well, I think that it's about the fact that all through history there's been this tight relationship between the church and the power. And in its latest vision, I mean, I'm talking about Patriarch Kirill's vision of what he thinks Russian Orthodoxy is. It's sort of hollowed out the content about what it means, I think, to be a Christian. And I'm speaking not as someone, I'm not a follower of any religion, but I feel that there's so much show and so little content that I feel it's disillusioned a lot of people that might have sought refuge and solace in the church, which I feel is a sad thing for Russia and for the wider world.
Sophie.
If you want to understand how power operates in the world and global politics, you cannot do it without women's health. From modern conflict to development aid to diplomacy, women's health is the centre in which power works in the world.
To put it better myself. Bronwen, finally.
I guess the takeaway would be the economy is cultural and historical, so question your assumptions about what you mean when you talk about the economy.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, very much. Thank you to Bronwen Everill, Lucy Ash, Sophie Harman, and Graham Lawson. And that's it for tonight. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the British Academy team for organising everything, for the whole team behind the scenes as well, to the judges for reading all the books and for their hard work and excellent shortlist, and especially thanks to the authors for all your time and conversation. Now, the British Academy will announce the winner of the prize tomorrow evening, so be sure to follow us on social media, probably sort of later, 8:30, 9, something like that, if you want to be the first to hear the news. Now, as you've been hearing, the 2025 shortlist is made up of 6 exceptional books. Now, you can buy copies of all the books. I hope you'll buy all of them. From this event, the ones we've been discussing tonight, from all our authors, and they are on sale just outside this room, and I'm sure the authors will be happy to sign them for you. Our partner bookshop is the London Review Bookshop. Now, before we finish our event, I'd like to invite the President of the British Academy, Professor Susan Smith, to share her closing reflections on the shortlist and on our discussion this evening. Susan.
Thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words. And to be honest, I'm not really quite sure where to start, because really, how do you follow this? I'm certainly not going to try and do a roundup or a summary, because these are absolutely critical, important debates that are going to run, and we've got lots of time afterwards to continue discussing them. So that's not a very good thing for me to do. I could just share a thought that's been sort of crystallising into my mind over the past few weeks and has absolutely firmly hit me on the head today, which is how very pleased I am that the President of the British Academy doesn't have to sit on the judging panel, because being able to differentiate among these is really well out of my skill set. But I have had the opportunity to read all of these books and also to listen to this discussion tonight. And what I can say is that these books, they are really masterworks in evidence-based storytelling. They are really powerful narratives that take us through facts and truths that we didn't really imagine were there, and which now suddenly we can't imagine the world without. They kind of hold a mirror up to us, I think. I don't think you can read any one of these books and emerge being quite the same person. Something has changed and you really can't go back. And that's true as well of the way you see the world. It's like a looking glass, something shifts and you can't go back. And the world is always a little bit different. And that is the power of this kind of writing to me. And it does something which we want to do as well at the British Academy, which is it really casts light on the essence of what it is to be human. It gives us a sense of the character and the quality, the conduct, the ways of going on that are essentially, quintessentially about human life. They make us think about the future and delve into the past. And there's one other thing that I'll round off with, which is it reminds me of another set of things to get up for in the morning, which is to read these books. We should all set our alarm clocks just that little bit earlier. Get up, don't bother with the news, leave the chatbot alone. Get right into one of these books, because you will not be able to get your hands on the treasure they contain if you don't actually read them. So thank you for that impetus. We look forward to reading much more. And can I just add my thanks to the ones that Rosie gave, to the publishers of the books that have brought the authors forward, and most importantly to our British Academy teams, to the tech teams, the AV, the events teams and the development teams. And thank you to you as well for coming. It's been a fantastic evening. Looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you, Rosie.